across every news network, you're watching the same story on repeat. Special forces descending from the sky, a Latin American president in handcuffs, commentators praising tactical precision and strategic brilliance. They want you focused on the spectacle, on the daring raid, on the military success, because if you're watching the helicopters, you're not watching the balance sheet. This wasn't regime change for democracy. This wasn't about human rights violations or drug cartels. This was a debt collection operation with gunships. There's an old rule in geopolitics that everyone pretends doesn't exist. You cannot sanction the countries that control your vital resources, not forever, not without consequences. For 23 years, the United States tried to defy this rule. They sanctioned Venezuela. They froze assets. They recognized parallel governments. They funded opposition movements. They did everything except the one thing they just did. Until this week, when all of that collapsed in the most revealing way possible. On December 28th, Nicolas Maduro signed energy agreements with China worth $18 billion. 2 days later, Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, quietly requested a meeting with Venezuelan officials in Panama, not to threaten, not to impose conditions, to negotiate access to oil that Washington has spent 2 decades trying to destroy. What you're witnessing is not diplomacy, it's capitulation that got interrupted by helicopters, and it reveals something critical. When an empire loses control over resources, it once considered guaranteed, the collapse doesn't arrive gradually, it arrives in cascade. Let me show you the numbers that explain why this happened now, why this week, why this operation couldn't wait. Venezuela controls the largest certified oil reserves on the planet, 303.8 billion barrels. Iran, its strategic ally, controls another 208.6 billion. Together, they represent 32% of global proven reserves, and both have just formally exited the financial system controlled by Washington. This is not theory. This week marks the breaking point where the architecture that sustained American hegemony for 80 years began its irreversible disintegration. But to understand why American helicopters just landed in Caracas, you need to understand a problem that almost nobody is talking about: the refinery mismatch. The media has been selling you a story for years. They told you the shale revolution made America energy independent. They told you the United States is now the world's largest oil producer and therefore doesn't need to care about the Middle East or Latin America anymore. This is a half-truth, and in geopolitics, a half-truth is a full lie. The United States does produce massive amounts of oil, but it produces light, sweet crude. It's like champagne, bubbly, light, expensive to extract, and not what American refineries were built to process. The problem is this: the massive refineries in Texas and Louisiana, the industrial backbone of American energy, were built 50 years ago. They were designed to process heavy, sour crude, the thick sludge-like oil that comes from Venezuela and the Middle East. America produces champagne, but its engines run on diesel. For decades, they solved this by importing heavy crude from Saudi Arabia. But that relationship is effectively dead. Saudi Arabia is no longer the gas station of the West. Riyadh is cutting production to keep prices high. They're joining BRICS. They're ignoring calls from Washington. The Saudi prince has made it very clear he's no longer interested in being a vassal state. So the United States faced a mathematical problem. They were running out of the specific type of oil needed to keep their refineries running at capacity. And worse, they had already played their emergency card. Over the last 2 years, the administration drained the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. The SPR is meant for war. It's meant for national emergencies. It is not meant to buy votes by artificially lowering gas prices before elections. Yet they opened the taps. They flooded the market with millions of barrels to keep prices down. Now the bill has come due. The SPR is at its lowest level since 1983, 351 million barrels. That's it. Under the Biden administration, 180 million barrels were released in 2022 alone to control prices after the Ukraine conflict started. Those barrels have not been replaced. The International Energy Agency projects a deficit of 1.2 million barrels daily for 2025 if tensions with Iran escalate and Russian sanctions remain in place. So Washington looked at the map. They looked for heavy crude suppliers. Canada is already pumping at maximum capacity. Russia is sanctioned and hostile. Saudi Arabia is uncooperative and pivoting toward Beijing. That left only one option: the massive heavy crude fields of the Orinoco Belt Venezuela currently produces 780,000 barrels daily. Under Chinese technical management and Russian financial support, that production could reach 1.4 million barrels daily within 18 months. But here's the problem that triggered this entire operation: that oil is already committed. China signed oil prepayment contracts with Venezuela worth $62 billion between 2007 and 2024. Russia provided another $17 billion in credit lines backed by crude shipments. India, completely indifferent to American sanctions, now imports 340,000 barrels daily of Venezuelan oil, refines it, and re-exports it to Europe as Indian product. The United States tried 4 strategies to break this encirclement. Every single one failed. The first strategy was maximum pressure through sanctions. It failed because Venezuela developed export networks completely outside the SWIFT banking system. Ships with flags of convenience, payments in yuan, refineries in Malaysia. Washington discovered that sanctioning paper doesn't stop oil molecules from moving. The second strategy was regime change through proxies. They spent millions backing Juan Guaido, recognizing him as the legitimate president, even though he never controlled a single military barracks. By 2023, even the Venezuelan opposition had abandoned him. American recognition became an international joke. The third strategy was diplomatic isolation. It failed because 134 countries never recognized Guaido. Latin America, including Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico, restored full diplomatic relations with Caracas between 2022 and 2024, completely ignoring Washington's objections. The fourth strategy was conditional licenses, allowing companies like Chevron limited permission to operate in Venezuela, but with strings attached. This is failing right now because Maduro learned the fundamental lesson: never trust American concessions designed as control levers. And then came the final trigger, the currency war. Intelligence reports that mainstream media is conveniently ignoring suggested that Caracas was preparing what financial analysts were calling a nuclear option. Venezuela was on the verge of officially integrating its energy sector into China's cross-border interbank payment system, CIPS. They were preparing to price their entire reserve, the largest on Earth, not in dollars, but in a basket of currencies led by the yuan and backed by gold. If this had happened, it would have been a signal to the entire global South. It would have proven that you can possess massive resource wealth outside the American banking system and survive. Washington saw this as an existential threat. Let me explain why this matters so much. The American dollar is not backed by gold. It hasn't been since 1971. It's not backed by industrial productivity. The manufacturing base has been hollowed out for decades. It's backed by one thing: an agreement made 50 years ago with Saudi Arabia. Oil must be sold in dollars. This is the magic trick, because every nation